Hey folks, welcome to this week. So this week we're just going to walk through and introduce Semantic HTML and explain what that is in a moment, and just have a look at some style guides for CSS, for HTML, and a little bit on typography. So, fonts is kind of how we would think about them, about typography. I'll jump into our Semantic HTML. And you'll go through a lot of this in the lab, and there's no lab walkthroughs this week, so give everything a go. We had a bit of a bumper walkthrough lab session last week, so give these a go. They should be straightforward enough. They're very tried and tested, so feel free to reach out on Slack if there's any problems at all with them. So first off, semantic or semantics, it's helpful to know what it actually means, because a lot of time in tech you come across words that you think you should know, but don't understand the meaning of them, ironically. So semantics is the study of linguistic meaning, and it's the quick Wikipedia definition. Not really supposed to use Wikipedia in academic contexts, but it's useful in this context for if you want to go dig a little bit deeper into the semantics of semantics. And yeah, just a very simple dictionary definition of it there as well, relating to the meaning in language or logic. And what does that mean when we talk about it within the context of HTML? Really, it means by viewing the HTML tags, we can infer the meaning or understand the meaning of the individual elements on the HTML page. So rather than relying on an ID of footer or an ID of header, we have tags that are actually called header and footer. So these give content on the page meaning and structure, and semantics portray, the value of content on the page and not just its style. So what makes this important is if you were to think about accessibility, and when we speak about accessibility, we mean available or accessible to everyone, regardless of whether or not, there may be a visual impairment when trying to view a website. We use tools like screen readers to help people navigate web pages, and semantic markup can be interpreted by these tools to help focus people, say, on the articles, the sections, the headers, whichever of the page that they might be interested in. And again, another tool, another machine, I guess if a screen reader is a machine as well, search engines. They can infer or understand the page just by parsing the HTML. From a development perspective, it makes maintenance a lot easier, and new developers can grasp the structure of a web page quite quickly. And it can really help, if you're updating styles, you don't have different IDs everywhere, where you've heading in one ID, or headings in the other ID, or header in the other ID. They all mean the same thing because they're specific tags, and we'll review those. So, semantic HTML, some definitions. Let me get out of the way. Is text, wrapped in elements that reflect the content. So a paragraph is contained in a P element. So you've already seen those. A sequential list is contained in an ordered list element, and a large block of text quoted from another source is contained in a block quote element. So you've already seen some of these already. Semantic HTML, is not H1 used for making text bigger. So you're like, okay, you're using it from a styling perspective there, rather than the semantic meaning of this is the most important heading on the page. You know, using a block quote, you know, should just be used, you know, you really shouldn't just use it just for offsetting text. You know, an empty paragraph element to insert blanks, not a great idea. And, you know, text should contain really no stylistic information directly. You shouldn't really use, you know, the formatting tags such as font or center, and no reference to colors or locations in classes or IDs. So why would we use Semantic HTML? It can make our code lighter, more easy to understand. Accessibility is mentioned, search engine optimization is mentioned, repurposing, you know, which is maintenance, and developer comprehension. So you'd be sick to death of looking at this diagram by the end of today. But it's a very simple diagram, you know, to help us understand why semantic elements would be important. And if we think about our websites up to this point, you know, we've had elements with IDs, we've had divisions with IDs, you know, of header, footer, main content, secondary content or aside, and things like that, and IDs of nav. But tags exist for all of these things. So the nav element represents a section of a page that links to other pages or to parts within the page. So, you know, we've had our navigation section with our list of links in there. We can now replace that if we used a division or a div with a nav element. Article represents a complete or self-contained composition in a document. So this could be something like a forum post, a magazine or a newspaper article, a blog entry, user submitted content, or any independent item of content. So you want really, you know, there is a main tag, but you also want you may have multiple areas of focus on your website. You tend to want to use article for those. The section element, a generic section of the document. So thematic grouping of content. So the theme of each section should be identified by including a heading as a child of the section. So if we just take a quick look over here on the right hand side, we have our article. We have a header within our article. And note we can put headers, you know, within articles, not just at the top of the page. We have a section within our article, and each section then has a heading. And you note that we're going from H2 down to H3 here. And we have a section over here as well. So the aside, if we think, I think we call it potentially, was it our sidebar secondary content? I can't remember. I think it was our sidebar we called it. So, you know, contains content that is tangentially related to the content, you know, in the aside of the page, could be considered separate from the main content. And, you know, often they're sidebars, potentially in a different type of typography. We have the header and footer, you know, the header introductory content for its nearest ancestor section. So that just means, you know, the header is most likely one of the first tags within a tag like an article or a main. And can contain navigational aids there as well. So a lot of the time as well, potentially you might have navigational aids within your headers. And a footer, you know, the footer of the page, the nearest ancestor section, section in content, or the root element. So A footer typically contains information about a section such as who wrote it, links to related documents and copyright data. So you could have a footer on your main page, directly below the HTML tag. Sorry, direct ancestor to the HTML tag. Typically, you put them at the bottom of your page, but you don't have to. You probably should. But you could also have a footer within your articles. So checking out the HTML spec, you can see the different sections of the page. So we have articles, sections, sides, different groups, headers, footers, and so forth. Excuse me. So one question that I definitely asked when I looked at this stuff first was, is an article and a section, is a section always a child of an article? What's the story here? And I wasn't the first person to ask this question because it's on the spec, the question. So a section typically forms a part of something else, and an article is its own entity. And as usual with these things, there's not a straightforward answer, depends on the author's intent. So we could imagine a book with a Granny Smith chapter, that said, juicy green apples makes great filling for pies. That would be a section because, there'd be lots of other chapters, other kinds of apples in the book. A tweet about an apple, this would be an article because it stands on its own. So a comment on an article is not part of the article on which it is commenting, therefore it's its own article. And this just makes things more confusing for me. I want some hard, fast rules, but I know from my life in tech, there's rarely hard, fast rules. But generally, I think, the tweet one is a good kind of way of thinking. A tweet stands on its own, or an X post, I guess, as it's called now, and that is an article within itself. So worth digesting that, taking a second to read it. It's worse when someone else reads it out. And considering, the main articles that might be in your website and which of these might be a section. And to take the simplistic view that a section is always in an article, I'm not really going to argue with that, honestly. So the heading of this says, the new semantic elements in HTML, but new is a relative term. 15 years ago, maybe 10. I don't know. I can't remember. But, up to the point of the introduction of the semantic elements, we did suffer from, overuse of divs and the like. So here's an example of divitis. And even before I jumped into, a lot of semantic HTML, I would have done a lot of kind of back-end engineering code, Java and things like that. And really from that, you're trying to impart meaning on your code as you're writing it. So it's the legendary or the mythical self-documenting code. So when I started looking a bit more at front-end development and started seeing constructs like div all over the place, even though I hadn't lived in that space for a very long time, I knew it was a bad idea. It's just like that just looks horrendous. You have a div with an ID of a header or a class of a heading, or why not just use a heading? So excessive use of divs can make pages difficult to interpret, both by a human and a machine. An accessibility reader has not a hope of reading this. And strangely enough, HTML like this is typically can be, well, I don't want to say typically, it can be produced by things like frameworks like React, like Angular, all these different toolkits that you would build up in an abstract way your web page, potentially, less so abstract in some of them, that they would then output HTML, and a lot of it would be device code. I have no idea if they're any better right now. Potentially they are. When I use React, I don't usually look at the basic HTML it produces anymore. I just kind of go with the flow. Maybe I should. So I love flowcharts. So I'm going to make you love flowcharts. So, when to use a certain flowchart, you might use this to, answer the question. When to use a specific semantic element. So, is it a major navigation block? Use nav. Does it make sense on its own? Use an article. Is it required to understand the current content? Yes. Would you move it to the appendix? Yes. A figure. Is it logical to add a heading? Use a section. Does it have any other semantics? Use an appropriate element, and eventually you end over a div on the right hand side. So get used to looking at flowcharts. Great for programming. Great for understanding code as well. If you're not familiar with them, go get familiar. You won't necessarily need them for this module. But for me, if I'm trying to reason code, I use flowcharts a lot. Maybe that's just me. So we can have different orders or different structures. So, here's something we'd be familiar with. Let's take like a nav on the left-hand side, a header at the top, footer at the bottom, main in the middle, and a side at the side. Seems pretty good. There's nothing stopping you, except me maybe, putting a footer at the top of your page. You can do it if you want. It's not something I give marks for. So, with great power becomes great common sense. So don't put your footer at the top of the page. I'm just going to say that right now. But you could. Nothing's stopping you. So I think the main reason to kind of show this type of stuff is really, look, they're just elements with a semantic meaning. There's no rules in place to stop you from doing it. Your browser's not going to give you an error if you put a header at the bottom or footer at the top, kind of thing. So yeah, header would typically have a nav in it as well. So we put our nav element within our header. So hopefully the need for semantic elements makes sense there. And in the lab, you'll step through taking one of the examples and removing as many divs as we can. Generally, say for your next assignment, when I'm grading, I really do look for, semantic meaning in the page. And it becomes more difficult to use semantic elements sometimes when you start using frameworks, like we'll start using next week. So you'll see you'll go look at the documentation for a framework and it's not using the semantic elements. You think, well, maybe I shouldn't. But we'll get into that next week. So now that we've covered semantic elements, and I just want to go through and introduce the idea of style guides for the likes of HTML and CSS. So style guides exist, published by lots of different companies. Big tech companies in particular will have them. So you can go look at Google's style guide for HTML. But typically every project would have a style. A style guide, kind of open source projects as well would have a style guide. And the styles are typically enforced automatically using what is called a linter. You may have come across linters in programming. If you have your code all over the place and you hit save and it formats the code for you, that's typically controlled by a linting configuration. Lint. If you haven't heard it before, you'll cover linters when you get into maybe the more heavy development side of this course, or maybe the next step on the course as well. But typically, Google would have a configuration for a linter, which would mean that if you try and submit maybe an update to one of their repositories that breaks one of these rules we're going to go through now, it wouldn't let you do it, which is the way it should be. So you can go look at the Google Style Guide, and we'll have a review of some of the pieces of the Style Guide that we find useful. So if we were to consider this HTML and this CSS, you may be surprised to hear that developers can argue over how the indentation works here. Is it a tab or is it a space? What is a tab? So one of those questions of the universe that developers like to argue about. But typically, well, I'm just going to say you want to indent with spaces because tabs can be different numbers of spaces depending on the operating system. So you want to indent with spaces and indent with 2 spaces at a time. And you can set this up on your linter or in your IDE, in your Sublime or whichever as well. You don't need to use a separate linter. And as well then with the same with CSS, you want the indentation. And the indentation lets you see that the list items are within the list. Seems simple enough. But if there's something we could argue about, we will. So what's not recommended here, from a capitalization perspective, is, we don't want to use capitals for the names of our tags. We don't want to use capitals for the names of our attributes. We want to do something like the below here. Again, same here in our CSS value in our rule. We want to use lowercase. So it applies to HTML element names, attributes, attribute values, CSS selectors, properties, and property values. With the exception of, let's say, if you're putting a string in there that you're going to display, like the Google string over here. So it's a good idea to use encoding as well, and the encoding to use would be UTF-8. So this is something you might have seen popping into, the header of the head, of your HTML page, and your Sublime text or your VS Code might just put it in there automatically. So we essentially want to default to using UTF-8, which is just a encoding character set, which will allow us to do simpler things later on with special characters. And if all of our pages use UTF-8 and they're committed into the same repository, we can keep consistent with how we include things like special characters within our web pages. So the W3C says we should save our pages as UTF-8. Always declare the encoding, and you want to try and avoid. Well, I'll let you read that. I won't read it all. You'll see an example as we move forward in the document here. We want to set our document type as HTML, which has come from HTML5. And if you remember our talk about HTML versions, we no longer have a numbered version. It's a living spec. But when HTML5 was introduced, it introduced the doc type of HTML rather than the rather large doc type above of W3C DTT HTML 401 transitional EN. Rolls right off the tongue. So use the doc type as mentioned there, which is just HTML. So use valid HTML where possible, which might seem obvious, but in the top, you can see we have a title, we have an article, and this will render, probably render perfectly well in your page, because your browser tries to be somewhat forgiving sometimes, but you can't rely on consistency and consistent behavior and rendering across different browsers with different tools. And if you try and parse this, say if you're trying to scrape web pages using a program, say automatically, it won't have a good time with this here. So you can use tools within your build pipelines. So you don't necessarily know what a build pipeline is right now, but so when you commit your code to, let's say, a repository somewhere, it goes through a build pipeline and deploys out on production, let's say. You can put checks in there to prevent invalid HTML from going out to production. And there is something like a W3C HTML validator, which I think you can just point it at your website and it will validate your HTML for you. And there's plenty of HTML validators you can paste your HTML into as well. So semantics, use HTML according to its purpose. And so hopefully after the semantic HTML talk, we know what that means. So up above here, I don't think you've seen JavaScript really yet. So here we have a division where we're saying on click, run some JavaScript to go to a page. When in reality, all we really needed there was an anchor with a href to link to the recommendations page. So this would be over engineering, using JavaScript to make a link, and using a div. So, you have to look at this and go, why, how? Now you have JavaScript to maintain and debug, whereas you do not here, down at the bottom. So use the elements for their semantic meaning, which we've already covered today, really. So don't use entity references. So this goes back to our UTF-8. So if you're define UTF-8, you can use symbols for special characters, whereas if you have different encoding styles, you might encode characters differently, but UTF-8 allows us to do that. There are a couple of exceptions, special meaning characters like the less than and ampersand, as well as a greater than, obviously, or any like invisible characters like no break spaces, which I don't think you've seen yet. I don't think you need to worry about it either yet. So there is in the HTML spec that tags can be omitted. So this HTML here can become this HTML and still be seen as valid HTML. So we've got rid of our HTML, we've got rid of our head, but in reality, we shouldn't trust the document in this case. And it's not just because I'm some sort of conspiracy theorist. It really is, just too kind of radical for right now. So don't do the recommended in this case. Of course, like we're losing meaning here anyway by not having our title. But we want our pages structured in a certain way. The amount of tools out there that are built to expect the regular HTML structure. So if you decide to listen to the spec and like trim away all these different tags, a lot of things will probably start breaking. Maybe Chrome or something will work in your browser because it understands the HTML specification. But if you have any other programs out there that rely on your website for some reason, they probably will break. So this is the case of, yes, style guides are great, but you kind of have to also have your own opinion on things as well. Just don't fight silly battles is all I'd recommend. So the type attributes. So if we take a look at our link here, we have a type of text CSS. We don't need that anymore when our relation is a style sheet, because it's the default. And the same within a script tag, we no longer need the type because the default is just understood to be JavaScript. So having them is fine, but you don't need them there anymore. So that's something, the style guide, and it can be safely done even for old browsers at this point as well. So general formatting, use a new line for every block, list, or table element. And this is in your page when you're writing it. You could, in theory, have all of your HTML on one line across the whole page because it's more efficient. But no, you don't want to have that. You can't maintain that. So generally having formatted code can really help you, even if it does seem like a waste of space sometimes. Quotation marks, always use double quotation marks. Just don't use the single quotes. Around attribute values, specifically, really, like, just don't use the single quotes, use double quotes. And always have your alternative content for multimedia. So always have your alternative, say, for an image. And this can really help for things like screen readers, for accessibility. So you're always thinking about the accessibility. So yeah, HTML style guide, spent a little bit of time on that. So we'll have a look at, say, the CSS one as well. See if there's anything controversial in there. So this is the same style guide we're looking at, and we're just going to look at the CSS part. So you can provide your URL to a validation services to go check your website and check that your CSS is valid. A lot of the time, as I mentioned, this is done, say, as part of your build process or as part of your Git commit process as well, to not allow invalid HTML or CSS get into your repository or out to production. So this is good for not feeling like you're out on your own, reinventing the wheel every time you want to name a class. So using meaningful or generic ID in class names instead of cryptic names, presentational names. So if we were to take a look at what that actually means, no one knows what this means. But if you see here, we have a style that's like button green. It's like, no, you don't want to name your classes like that, or your style, your rules like that, because you want it more to represent the purpose of the element in a more generic way, rather than button green, button red, button blue. It could be submit button, it could be that type of thing, or confirmation button or positive button or whatever. So functional or generic names reduce the probability of unnecessary document or template changes usually. If you have your button green and you change it slightly to a different type of green, do you change the name? I don't know. So you generally want to be specific in the case of IDs, but also sometimes with classes, where you're like, okay, we have a gallery, we have our login, we have a video, and then generic as well, can be alternative or auxiliary, or my brain is blank at the moment, so let's keep going rather than try and waste more time. But in general, you want to keep your class names functional. So either functional or generic, rather than describing what's inside of the rule. It's kind of a way to think about it. So use, say, ID and class names that are as short as possible, but as long as necessary. So what that means is, if you have something like navigation, it's quite natural to reduce that to nav. Whereas if you have ATR, I have no idea what that means. It could be attribute. In this case, it's author. Who would have known? So this is really one of those, you can't really build an automatic checker for these. Well, maybe you can. In the age of this age, everything is possible, I guess. But I hate saying common sense prevails. So what's common is not common. But really, you want to take a step back and think, does this ID or class name convey a meaning? That it would be generally understood, but then of course across maybe language divides or culture divides or societal divides, something being reduced to a, might not make sense to other people. Type selectors, avoiding qualifying ID and class names with type selectors. So, unless necessary, do not use element names in conjunctions with IDs. Avoiding unnecessary ancestor selectors is useful for performance reasons, but also for understanding. And what that means is you kind of want to shy away, even though it is possible, and even though we have used it, you do want to kind of shy away from, unordered list with an ID of example, because you just keep going down the chain. Just use an ID of example. Use a class of error. Just shy away from too many styles that, you're creating ancestors as you move through ancestor selectors. It's bad for performance reasons. I find it quite difficult I think we had some very, I don't want to say funny examples, but ridiculous examples of, the LIOL, OLLI styles are selectors a few lectures ago. So you want to have, as we mentioned, kind of Occam's razor, in the user psychology, keep things simple. From a developer's perspective, we also want to keep it simple. Remove complexity as much as possible. So use shorthand properties where possible as well. So a lot of the properties can have shorthand, and you'll find those in the documentation. And again, you can probably set linting rules to help you there too. So, what we have on the top here can become what's on the bottom, and it's infinitely more readable here. You potentially, have to have a little bit more understanding, say, of what's happening here with the font, because, you have a specific order which things are mentioned. But it's Google Style Guide saying you should know that already. So, condense it as much as possible in this case. But as you're learning, feel free to start out with, the longer way of doing things, and then try and go through it and try and see if you can make it more concise, but also still understandable. And how far you go can depend on your style guide, and that's why style guides are handy and useful. So separate words with your IDs and classes with a hyphen. Don't concatenate words, abbreviations, don't use camel case, that type of thing. Don't use underscores, use hyphens. Alphabetize declarations, can't speak for some reason. So put declarations in alphabetical order to achieve consistent code. So people know where to look for certain things. Might seem somewhat pedantic, but you can actually get like your IDE or your text editor, and when you press save, it'll put them in alphabetical order for you. So that's fine. But it just helps from a maintenance perspective, and you kind of know where to find things. Use a semicolon after every declaration for consistency. And CSS quotation marks. Here they're saying to use the single quotations rather than double quotations. And do not use quotation marks in URI values. So, contradiction, with the HTML style guide, it's telling us to just use single quotes. And if you're going to use a URL in, say, an import, don't use the quotes there as well. The logic behind that I actually don't know, so I probably should look into that. But the style guide just tells you not to. So, yeah, I mean, it's probably one thing, I didn't write this, but this is one thing I would tell a lot of people when they're jumping into projects, that may already exist in a company. Take a few minutes to look around and see how people are doing things. You should really have, automated style checkers in place anyway. But you should try and make, your code fit into the code that exists, unless you have a conversation about it and say, this is not great the way it is at the moment. I'd like to move it to a different place for X, Y, Z reasons, not just because this is what I like. Then you kind of start deviating from the style. But maybe, in a new project, you make the style better. So it's worth looking around into the project, fitting in, and then maybe raising some concerns. Consistency is really the key here as well. You can use different ways and frameworks, as you're walking through your development kind of life cycle. Your development career. Again, I can't talk for some reason. And one of them, I'll just give you a quick example of, how a framework could be introduced to help you standardize on certain things as well. So we've looked at style guides, and the block element modifier is more of a framework, was probably the wrong word to use, more of a methodology to use the tools that you have now to create, reusable components and, code sharing when you're working on development. So you might jump into a project, as we're talking about here. If you're going into code, look at the existing styles, look at the existing style guide, be consistent with what already exists. And the project you're working on might use something like the block element modifier, which is just really presented here as an example. We'll start using a framework next week, which is opinionated, and some people like and some people don't like. But you can see it makes things consistent, but sometimes it can reduce your creativity. But for the likes of block element modifier, it really is a way of naming your CSS rules and your classes to in a standardized way, in a more maintainable way, once you understand what it means. So we have the ideas of blocks, we have the ideas of elements, and we have the ideas of modifiers. So a block, as we've been talking about, is a block within our page. And you can see here, we're saying we have a div with a class of a block, and we've defined this block over here. So you can see this is a more generic way, and this isn't something we're going to do. This is just an example of how you might create a methodology or a framework using the tools to maybe make something more reusable and understandable. And generally, this has been done so many times, you don't really want to do it yourself, and the block element modifier approach is one way you could do it. So the CSS class, we add a short prefix to the namespacing of block, and we say, let's say, this block is, color 42 or whatever, right? So off the top of my head, I don't know what that is. But I could probably work it out if I gave it another second. And then, blocks contain elements. So those elements, might be, as we see down here, a span. And then each of these elements will have a modifier. So you end up with, let's just say, have a look over here. You end up with a div, which is a block. And within that, we have some elements. Well, this is a block level element, I guess. So we have block level modifiers. But we can also have element level modifiers. And all this creates is a hierarchy within your CSS rules, a hierarchy within your page, which naturally exists already because you have blocks and elements. And what's new here is the introduction of the idea of a modifier, which is essentially just adding more styles to your block. So, so you say, like, we have a block and we add a block element modifier, a block color black, a block color red. And this will be very similar to what we're going to start doing next week. But again, it's just an example of how you could use the tools you have to create some sort of convention across a project. Generally, at this stage, I shy away from inventing conventions like that because they've been done so many times that you generally just end up, if you create your own, end up creating some sort of tech debt. But if you have an idea that you think would be useful, get it out there, get it open sourced, get input on it, and you might actually introduce a new methodology or framework with how to work with, let's say, HTML and CSS. So, so you can see, I will show this example. I was just going to skip over it because we're not really going to be looking at this much more. But you can see, we've created some sort of naming convention, naming structure from the use of, our block elements. We have our form is our block, and then we have, our form is our element, excuse me. And then we have our modifiers. So form theme Xmas, form simple, and we have our form input with no modifiers. And then we have our form submit, which is an element, and our modifier there is that it's disabled. And then when you look at the CSS, you can see it's all, quite grouped together, maybe a little bit easier to maintain. But it's just an interesting example of how you might try and create order within potential chaos, I guess. But we will see something similar next week when we start using Bulma and how that works to start creating websites that look a little bit more professional than what we've been doing, I would say. In the labs anyway. I haven't seen your assignments, so I'm sure they're actually quite good. They usually are. So let me just go back to our page here. So, we've covered Semantic HTML, we've covered a style guide, CSS style guide, a quick example of how you might put all that together in like a framework or a methodology, really. And in the first lab here, you're going to go through and add some semantic elements, but then you're also going to introduce the navigation plugin, which will automate, your nav bar. So you can use it in a layout without having to, have different styles, definition, or move the active style around on different pages. The navigation plugin in 11t will do it for you. So you'll step through that as well. And the solution is provided, and this, of course, is not related to, your first assignment at all. This will all be examined in your next assignment. So just a quick run through or a chat about then typography, which is the area of fonts. Well, which is how the majority of people would think about it, but we'll go through the actual definitions now. So when we think about fonts, we generally think about why we would use a certain font or different fonts, or maybe we wouldn't think about it at all. So if you're in an engineering context creating websites or applications, you're like, well, let's keep the fonts quite simple. Whereas if you're more design orientated, a fashion company or whatever, you might want to pick, different fonts depending on your use case or your community or something like that, So what is typography? So words and texts all around us, and in every piece of type you see, somebody has considered, say in signs, so road signs for one, company logos, branding, everyone or someone has either considered or failed to consider the typeface. And the whole idea of typography is to, almost from a semantic perspective as well, infer meaning, infer purpose into the text that is displayed to you. So the likes of a stop sign should be in your face to stop you, whereas a welcome sign should be, maybe not all capital letters with a red background shouting at you. So brands are often recognized by their typeface. Facebook, Google, Netflix, Spotify, you kind of, it just soaks in over time, specific typefaces that brands use. And the whole idea of, how a typeface as well. And when we say typeface, we really mean, a mixture of the font, the color, and, the spacing and how it's laid out. And we'll get into a bit more of the specifics now in a moment, but, you can infer quality by using different typefaces as well, as we can see here. I won't talk too much about pizza, I'll get too hungry. And, what is a typeface and what is a font? So I've been using them interchangeably. Most people use them interchangeably, and you would be incorrect to do so. So typically when people refer to fonts, they really mean a typeface. So designers are often unsure of the difference between these two, as they're often confused as the same thing. So we really want to, I guess, for the sake of this conversation and for me, to actually get the understanding so we can have a coherent conversation about it. So a typeface is a set of fonts in the same style, so like a family of fonts. So we might have the Arial typeface, Times New Roman, or Century Gothic, and a font is a single weight or style within a typeface. So from the Arial side of things, we have the narrow rounded black or black, Times New Roman regular. So they're all fonts within a typeface. So you can see as well, if you were to go design a typeface and its subsequent fonts, there's lots of different properties to configure. We won't go into it, but there's a whole science behind it. So we'll go into it a small bit here, but not each and every one of these properties. So font naming conventions. So, we have different weights of fonts. So, you'd be used to the likes of bold, but there's hairline, thin, ultralight, different widths, compressed, condensed, normal, and different styles, italic, small caps, swash, different optical sizes. So a caption, a text, a subhead, or different grades, which accommodate different weights for different printing conditions and different effects such as shadow or inline or outline. So these are all different names used within typography to describe typefaces and fonts. So if you were to look at different classifications of types, so typefaces, we have serif, so they're more traditional, and the serifs are the little feet or arms that hang off the end of the letters. So if we're to look here, see the little serifs down around here. So you start noticing them everywhere when you start looking. And then serif fonts are considered the easiest fonts to read, so they're often used within the body. So the body is, the most content on your page, so you want that to be easy to read. So there's different style serif type styles here. You can see pointing out the different feet and arms that hang off the edge. Then there's sans serif, so without the serifs in the typeface. So have an overall even stroke weight. So evoke a more modern, because they weren't created until the 19th century. So we're going back to printing here really as well. They can be harder to read, so often only used for a small amount of copy, subheadings or large headings. And when we say difficult to read, it kind of means it's difficult to at a glance see what the word is. So it's like when you see a word that's all capitals, your brain will take longer to figure out what it is because it can't draw from the cues. So here's an example of some of the sans serif type styles. Then there's script, which is kind of based more on handwriting, generally used for display or trade printing, if you want to be extra fancy. And and then things like decorative, where we'd have things like stencil or magneto, maybe used for some branding or for some signs, things like that. So we have typefaces, and one thing we've used in at least one of our websites was a masthead. So say in the App Store, where we have a title going across the front of, say, our page, but where the word comes from is from magazines. So you'll find when we talk about typefaces and fonts and the layout of articles and content, a lot of it comes from print, which are a lot of older terms used. So the next time you're standing in front of a magazine rack, I haven't looked at a magazine in I don't know how long. Probably should. It's actually quite a relaxing endeavor. Sit down and read a magazine. But taking a look at the fonts used on the cover, and then to see if there's a masthead. And generally the target audience can be figured out just by looking at the masthead. Examples of mastheads, Time, Vogue, Macworld, all these different magazines. It's interesting as well to look at the kind of evolution of these as well, from logos, typefaces and fonts, to see how they've evolved, over the years. And there's also the concept of web-safe fonts. So you can pick from hundreds of different fonts, but what a lot of people don't realize is that, fonts kind of need to be installed in your browser, and your browser comes with some fonts installed. And a lot of the time, these can be actually pulled from the operating system. So the fonts are supplied by the operating system. The browser knows where to look for them. And if they're not on the operating system, then a default font might be used by your browser. So when we consider web-safe fonts, they're very popular fonts that are available usually by default, either in the browsers or operating systems that are most proliferated around. So pre-installed on many operating systems. Not all systems have the same fonts installed. You can use web-safe fonts to choose several fonts that look similar that will most likely be installed on various systems. So what you do when you're defining a font in your CSS is you start with the font you want. And then you kind of, as you move through the fonts, down your list, they're like, well, if Times New Roman doesn't exist, use Times. If that doesn't exist, use serif. So you're getting more generic as you move down, which is the more correct way to do it. So start with a specific Times New Roman, then use Times, and then use serif. So it's like they're like fallbacks as you move down the line. So you want to use the one that's so your browser will try and use Times New Roman first. So it's just interesting to raise that, sometimes the fonts may not exist on your system. And as a designer, that's a nightmare because you don't want the default fonts to be chosen. So if we're going to look at the serif fonts, how they might render in a browser, you can see the headings and paragraphs and how they might look different with the different, font families. And again, with the sans serif as well, you can see maybe possibly a bit more jarring. And of course, we have Comic Sans there, which is, let's bring it back. So what to use on your website? So body text, as I mentioned, is the most common. You want body text looks, will have how it looks will have a noticeable effect on your page. So start with a font, point size, line spacing. We've seen how line spacing can really augment how someone looks at a web page, the length of the lines, because these 4 decisions will largely determine how the body text will look. And changing one of these can really change how your website and the text and content is perceived. So, there is a hierarchy to typography as well. And, we'll look at that now, where we look at the style first, we look at the size, the color encasing, and the placement, and how these can affect all different things. So, typeface and weight play a key role in establishing the hierarchy, especially for headlines and subheads. So generally speaking, we can see in that text, we don't know what's a heading, we don't know what's a subheading. So we want to change the heading styles, but we also want to change the headings case, color, and weight. So if we were to add some more color to our example here, well, let's go back to where we have no real hierarchy here. So we introduce a hierarchy of, type size with a bit of weighting. And, maybe introduce a little bit more color then as we move through. So you can see we're just kind of changing size as we move through. The document or the text is becoming a lot more readable and understandable just from first look from back here. It's just like a wall of text that you don't even want to read or want to look at, but you start getting drawn in a bit more here because of the use of headings. And then the use of color again might help with emphasis, and also the placement as well can help with context. So another example here, everything kind of merged together in a columnar layout, what's important, what's not important. Introducing some weighting, some style, or some sizing as well, potentially. Some color really helps us out in, if we want to really initially just see when things are on, we infer meaning from looking at the document and then going, oh, well, this is where all the times are. I look across and see what times I'm available. Use the headings, and use them for their semantic meaning as well when you're looking at typefaces and fonts. So to choose a font type, body text can be a sans serif or serif font, and sans serif were once preferred for screen text because they rendered better on lower resolution screens of the past. But the serif fonts, obviously have no problem rendering on the higher definition we have today. If you want to go finding fonts, we have a little lab on using Google fonts as well. So you can just see, you can use a font that's not installed on the operating system by using a hosted font service, and we'll use Google fonts to do that. So you can go installing fonts, but obviously you can't go installing fonts on other people's computers. I have a lab, very small lab this week, to just go and use Google fonts and see if you basically, in our head, we'll link to a font file, CSS file, I'm pretty sure. And then we can use those fonts that are defined there to use within our website. But of course, then that's something else that has to be downloaded as part of the load of the web page, which might cause some slowness, but typically not. So you can use something like Google Fonts, you can use something like Adobe Fonts, you can host them yourself. But really, the main thing is with typography is to keep things simple, keep very simple rules, in mind at all times. You want to use the number of fonts at a minimum, and stylized fonts such as like the script, maybe only for heading, the calligraphy style fonts, those types of things. Body text should be readable and clean, and nice line spacing in it as well. You don't want to justify text because typically this part of the world we want to left align. Other parts of the world you want to right align, depending on who's going to be reading it. Font embedding services like Google Web Fonts, which we'll use in our lab, can be quite useful. Just don't steal people's fonts without attributing them or buying them as well. And also make sure your different fonts match. Typically, maybe you want to stay within a typeface family. So yeah, that's just to kind of show like we're not going mad into designing in fonts, typefaces, and and it's just more to show you the world that's out there. So you're aware, but there's a whole science behind all this kind of stuff. So it can be just a bit enlightening to find out about it. So yeah, so as I mentioned, there is another lab here. Google Fonts to just go through. And you can have a mess around with it, embed some fonts on your website, and see how you get on. So that's everything today. Really, the main meat of what we want to take out of today is, we have semantic elements that we want to start introducing. We definitely want to start using those in our websites. We want to keep cognizant of there might be a style guide that we want to follow for both CSS and HTML. We're going with most of Google's recommendations for both of those. The labs themselves then will walk you through that, introducing the semantic elements and the nav plugin on 11t, and just a bit of an introduction to typography, to know that world exists. If you wanted to dig into any other, further into those slides, feel free if it's an area that interests you. But also then, how might we use some fonts that are not installed on people's computers in our websites, so we can use something like Google Fonts. So best of luck with all those things. Also include finished web repositories for things like the bundle store and the use of the grid layout. You would have been able to download all of these on the labs as well, but just they're there as well, just if you want to download them, keep them for future use or whatever. And yeah, we will see you on Slack, and good luck with the labs.